Thanks everyone for joining us. Our speakers today will be Cold Case Homicide Detective Meredith Hopper and Assistant Chief Jamie Resch. At the end of the presentation, we will have some time for questions. First, I want to introduce the primary cold case detective, Meredith Hopper.
Good morning. My name is Meredith Hopper, and I'm a detective with the Portland Police Bureau's Cold Case Homicide Unit. And I'm here today to talk about the resolution of the homicide case of Anna Marie Hlavka. Anna was murdered on July 24th, 1979. Anna lived in Northwest Portland in the area of 18 and Cooch. Anna actually worked at the McDonald's that was located about 19 in Burnside. Anna returned from work after her shift at McDonald's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She was alone in the apartment, and her sister, Roseanne, unfortunately had to discover her deceased several hours later. The original detectives, one of which is with us today, Detective Carrie Taylor, worked this case for many months and years trying to develop leads. Initially, there were quite a few leads that they developed. They collected fingerprints, blood evidence, they did polygraph tests and so forth, trying to discover her killer. Ultimately, though, the case went cold. In 2009, one of our retired detective volunteers, retired detective Dennis Baker, submitted a bunch of physical evidence to be analyzed by the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. Luckily for us, Dr. Janelle Moore discovered an unknown DNA profile, which we believe to be the suspect. In 2012, I was assigned to investigate this case. I investigated it for approximately 6 years. I aggressively pursued suspects. We submitted about 8 different DNA profiles, all of which I was certain was going to be the suspect. And every time Dr. Moore would tell me, nope, that's not the one. So actually, Detective McGuire, my partner on this case, and I talked with the Hlavka family in 2016. It's something unusual that we did, and I wanted to assure them that we weren't going to forget Anna Marie. Up to that point, we had no one else to develop any DNA evidence from, but I assured her that we would continue to pursue different technology that was hopefully going to come available in the future. In the spring of 2018, California law enforcement arrested the Golden State Killer. My colleagues and I are always interested in cold case homicides that are solved, so we were researching the way they did it. And the way they did it was through forensic genetic genealogy. Essentially, the DNA profile that they have from crime scenes, they were given to Parabon Nano Labs. They did the analysis, and their forensic genetic genealogist made the connection through family trees of who the killer was. At Cold Case, we were very excited by this, but like all things, old evidence tends to degrade. So we weren't sure if our evidence would be eligible for that type of testing. I contacted Dr. Moore. She put her in touch with the Parabon Lab staff, and they determined that it would be a good fit for this type of testing. We waited for about 3 months. They returned some information to us that there was potentially a solvability rate using this technique about maybe from 1 to 10, this one was about a 4. We told them to proceed because really at this point we didn't have much else to go on, and this was the best technology we had at the time. In October of this year, we received information from the Parabon staff, and we spoke with the actual forensic genealogist that did the work. She talked to us for about an hour, briefed us on the intimate details of forensic genealogy and how she made this connection. The Parabon Nanolabs people and the forensic genealogist group identified the suspect in this murder as Jerry Walter McFadden, and I believe he was born 3/28 of 48. McFadden was a multiple convicted killer and rapist out of the state of Texas. McFadden was ultimately executed by the state of Texas in October of 1999. Detective McGuire and I, our first question was, if he's such a bad guy, why was his DNA in CODIS? We researched that and we discovered that approximately 1995 in Texas is when they started taking the mandatory convicted felon DNA samples to introduce into CODIS. Well, McFadden was already on death row, and he was executed about 4 years later, so essentially they didn't get to him. His DNA wasn't in CODIS, and honestly, without this technology, we never would have solved this case. Upon researching McFadden, we did not find any connection with Oregon. Detective McGuire and I traveled to Texas. We met with many of his family members and were able to obtain DNA samples that were led to the confirmation of McFadden as our killer. One thing I want to point out about McFadden's family, they had nothing to do with his criminal activity. We respect their right to privacy in this case, and we hope that you do too. They're very hardworking, law-abiding people, and they had nothing to do with his criminal activity. And they submitted the DNA results in an effort to try to provide some type of resolution to the victim's family. And they're very saddened by these results. So Detective McGuire and I did receive the confirmation. I don't want to talk too much about McFadden. I'm sure he's interesting to all of you, but we want today to be about Anna Marie. And I also want to recognize and appreciate the efforts of Dr. Janelle Moore, because honestly, without her discovering that profile, none of us would be here today. And I also want to acknowledge the original investigators who worked tirelessly on this investigation. And without their good product, we wouldn't be here today either. I'd like to now introduce A.C. Resch.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming today. I'm Assistant Chief Jamie Resch, and I oversee the investigations branch of the Portland Police Bureau. First, to the Hlavka family, I would like to extend my sympathies for your grave loss. This was a horrific crime for your family as well as our community. Thank you to Detective Carey for your initial investigative work into this case, and thank you to Detective Hopper and Detective McGuire. Your diligence in this case, your tenacity and desire to bring resolution to Anna Marie's family is to be commended. Detectives in the Cold Case Squad continue to work homicide cases where the trail may have gone cold. Their motto is, "We don't give up, we never give up." The Portland Police Bureau currently has 275 cases that are deemed cold. The oldest case is from 1970, and the youngest victim was just 4 years old. So it is a reminder today that these cases exist and they can be solved. Many times there remains someone who knows something. Witnesses may contact the Cold Case Homicide Detail directly at 503-823-0400. And if you wish to remain anonymous, witnesses may provide information through Crime Stoppers of Oregon. Information on any unsolved felony may be eligible for cash rewards of up to $2,500. To learn more about Crime Stoppers, please visit crimestoppersoforegon.com, and please speak up for those who can't. Thank you.
We have put a number of materials on our website and release photos as well. One thing that we would ask from the public is to please take a look at the photos of McFadden. The detectives could still use any sort of tips or leads on his whereabouts when he was in Portland. We're going to open this up for questions, and so if you give me just 1 minute, we're going to invite Dr. Janelle Moore to come up here with us. Detective Hopper and Dr. Moore will be available for questions in a group setting, and then afterwards they'll be available for one-on-one interviews for a short time.
Any questions?
Can Dr. Moore explain how you were able to find the unidentified DNA profile years later? And I don't know if you can say where it was found, or if it was on clothing or not, or at the scene.
We were lucky in this case that the evidence was preserved, so it was pristine when I received it to do the initial analysis. The sample that we eventually matched to came from underneath Anna's fingernails. So it was surprising when we got the initial results, and it continues to be a landmark cold case for me from a scientific perspective, that we can get viable profiles from evidence that is so old.
Can you explain the reason it wouldn't have been able to get it earlier?
The reason that the profile wasn't developed earlier?
Yeah, I don't.
Like why it wasn't developed sooner?
Oh,
Or identified.
lucky for us, the fingernails weren't examined when the DNA technology was not available. So the samples themselves were in with other victim samples that had been analyzed previously. But when the DNA technology came on and we are able to do everything we can now with the technology, it was a perfect timing to look at those fingernail scrapings and the DNA technology together allowed us to develop this profile that led to the resolution of the case.
Typically in cold cases, we all know, but I think it's worth saying, the original detectives, particularly from 1979, they had no idea DNA was available. And DNA, even in my time in cold case, has advanced. And it's just continuing to get more sensitive, and it's a smaller amount of sample, and even more degraded sample is able to be compared.
And I would say when I came on in 2006 to the DNA lab, if I were to have analyzed this at that point, we probably wouldn't have gotten the results that we got just 3 years later.
Just a quick question so I understand. So the fingernails were already scraped back in the 70s, or did you have to review the body?
No, it was part of the standard kind of operating procedure is to scrape the fingernails and do various other things during the autopsy.
It just wasn't tested?
Yeah, because they didn't know. They kept them for different types of testing that was utilized back then, but obviously DNA testing was not available until much later.
Any other questions?
I don't know if you can talk about the forensic genealogy DNA matching and all, but is this the first time you've used this lab, and do you hope to use it for other of these hundreds plus cases?
So this is the first time we've used the lab. When this initially came out, we did a lot of research into Parabon Nanolabs and what their services were to offer. We combed through a lot of our cases. I, of course, was banging on the desk trying to get this case analyzed. This one, as I said before in my remarks, it's very unusual to get a full profile. A lot of times we get mixtures of profile, and we get the verbiage back from the lab is a direct comparison may be necessary in order to identify the suspect, which means it's not able to be uploaded into CODIS. So in this case, we were lucky with this one because it was a full profile. We're continuing to look for other cold cases that have that type of criteria, so we could utilize this service.
And can you explain the steps once you got the full profile and you're using this lab? You needed to get DNA from his relatives, or?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So we got the report back from the forensic genealogist. You guys got a handout about this, and I'm not even going to begin to try to understand and explain how they do what they do, but they gave us this name. And I even said, I'm like, that's great, but we need actual evidence to put with that name and our suspect DNA profile. We contacted the family, which obviously shares DNA with the suspect because he's clearly deceased, and they voluntarily gave their sample for comparison, and I submitted that sample to Dr. Moore.
Now, was he always a suspect, or just?
No, what's interesting about him, and like I said, I don't want to give a ton of time to him, but all of his criminal history and police contacts and even address information is all from about 3 counties in Texas. There was never any link to him coming up here. Detective McGuire and I did discover how he came up here and the way he came up here, so to speak. But as far as this case never would have been solved. He never would have risen to the level of a suspect. He has no record here in Oregon.
So, but you guys did track him here then?
We did. Yes, we know outside of the DNA results, we know that he was here in 1979.
There's, I guess, a 3-month window approximately that is unaccounted for between his June 22nd crime in Texas and then when he's arrested again in October of that year.
Correct.
Do you have an idea how long he's in the Pacific Northwest and specifically the Portland metro area?
We don't. We know that he was here at either the end of February, beginning of March. He spent some time here. We don't know how long. He was obviously accused and eventually convicted of the assault and kidnap in June of '79. So clearly he was in Texas in June, and he obviously returned here to the Pacific Northwest in July. And then how long he spent here, we don't know. That's one thing we're interested in, is if anybody recognizes these photos. He obviously had some type of association here with the Northwest, made friends, contacts, whatever. We're interested in finding out more about him to hopefully link him to other homicides in the area.
Do you know if the victim knew him, or?
I don't think so. No.
On a personal note, I know you probably work in cold cases, spend day after day, going home without much, and this is a pretty old one. I mean, it's kind of obvious that this would make you feel good, but I was just wondering in your words how you feel about this.
You know, this case in particular, I'm really glad we solved for a lot of reasons. I worked this case for a long time. I mean, it's an old case, obviously, but I worked it for the majority of my time here at Cold Case. I'm very, very happy that we were able to give some kind of resolution to the family. I don't think it ever goes away from them. I think the word closure is overused, but just having some answers to give them, it's a good thing. Yes?
How expensive a process was this, going through the private lab, and who picks up that cost?
Well, we were fortunate that my bosses, our bosses, Assistant Chief Resch, approved us for funds. The City of Portland paid for this cost. It's not uncommon for us to go through private labs in cold case because, to be honest, the Oregon State Police Crime Lab is fantastic to work with, but they have a finite amount of resources and personnel and time, and they work about cases all over the state. I would like it if they were my personal lab, but they're not. So we reach out to private labs pretty often. In my opinion, I don't think the cost was great. I don't know if Parabon really wants me to go into the nominal costs of what their services are, but it was, I think, definitely worth it.